So I will still need to have the authority to share my screen, Randy.
Yes, you already have it. Oh,
It
oh,
says
I
that
gave it
let's
I
share.
gave it to the wrong Daniel.
Okay.
Oh boy. Okay, sorry about that. You're ready to go, Lester.
Sure. So let me know when you can't see my screen.
I can see it now.
Yep, you're up.
Okay. That's good. That's fine. So now what do I need to do? Sorry about this. I need to stop it and started it again. Screens, documents, application windows, share. Okay. So you're seeing the slide, the committed communities of the Desert Fathers, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
So this is a very interesting topic that we will cover today, right? This is, as Randy mentioned it before in the chat, this is a period of time that it's not so understanding. There's not so understanding, nor in the Protestant side and the Catholic side. So this would be interesting and very stimulative for our understanding of apostolic communities, what happened in that period of time, and it is totally tied to the prophetic movement. And the scriptures and the development of the church itself as well. So this will be interesting to cover. But first of all, I would like to start with the idea that the monasticism is not just a Christian phenomenon. It is a universal human phenomenon. So the idea is that we can say with very confident that monasticism is not unique in Christianity. In even in every major religion, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Judaism, Islam, we can find a version of what we could call monastic life. So men and women stepping away from the mainstream society, they embrace a discipline, a sort of rule, solitude, prayer, renunciation, and they are distinct from the broader social body in order to seek what they think it is divine or more radical, or what would be the wisdom to achieve. So this expression vary in form in the human life, but they share some key elements. For example, the voluntary poverty we will discuss, where in the Greek philosophic asceticism, these key elements are present as well. So the voluntary poverty, the celibacy, fasting, prayer, obedience, all that, and as well the communal life is part of this phenomenon in human groups. So this is not always dictated by institutional authority. It is an impulse, a human impulse to do that. So rather than they emerge from religious imagination of a people, it is more like a hunger to encounter something that is transcendent and something that is in some way sacred, beyond the structures of the human life or the immanence of the human life. So this universality doesn't mean that all monasticism are the same, for sure. So, but it does mean that monasticism as such is not a late accidental invention of the church. It's not something that Christianity borrowed entirely from something different to look more spiritual. Instead, monasticism is a human phenomenon and a response to the transcendence of the holy or the mysteries that are part of the reality beyond the human life and the human material life. Saying that, I would like to cover the anthropological roots of monasticism and asceticism. So asceticism, before it is a religious doctrine, it was a human experience. It springs not from the theology, but from anthropology first. And if you allow me to put in those terms. So in other words, before we interpret theologically what would happen in other religious or people groups or human groups apart from Christianity, we must understand it as something that is deeply human. And since that, we can understand from the scripture why human beings are having those impulse towards a life that we call monastic. So across culture, we'll find that this instinct, it is an impulse in people. They drive to step away, to silence, to concentrate the mind, the heart, and focus on something that they think it is true that truly matters. So they were in the forest, they were in the deserts and mountains, caves. Men and women have left behind their comfort, their status of life, their status in society, and security to draw near something that was perceived as a ultimate. So I'm talking from a sociological and anthropological perspective. I want to make this clear. So this act of renunciation emerged from the tension that we would call, or from a dualist perspective that we will call, the tension between the sacred and the profane. Although myself and I think that most of us would agree that tension is a false tension indeed, because from my perspective, everything is sacred since it is created by God. So, but this was from some worldviews, this tension, this renunciation emerged from this perceived tension between what is sacred and profane. But I would make that clarification after that. What was the perception of the Christian monasticism in the specific? After in a minute. So, monasticism. So it is not, as I said before, a simply invention of Christianity. It's not merely a set of religious rules or copied behaviors from other religions or other sociological phenomena. So it is a path that the Christians themselves discovered by human beings again and again throughout history. And for Christian, it expressed the seek for that thing that is not in the middle of that tension between profane and sacred, but more like pursuing what is transcendent beyond the immanence. So this is the most distinct part of the Christian monasticism. So monasticism is not just theology. We need to think about it anthropologically and sociologically. And we had before, when I had the opportunity to talk to you about the sodalities from a sociological perspective. You remember that? So monasticism and the group and the of the group of the monks as well, we need to address it anthropologically and sociologically as well. What happened in that time, and what was the response of the monastic movement in order to solve a situation? Why they decided to flee from the more wider social body and create new social bodies. So we need to discover it historically, anthropologically, and sociologically. So the rooted is structured in human seeking for the transcendence. So I would like to share some similarities between the monasticism and Greek and Roman philosophical asceticism. So, for example, in the long before Christianity, the Greco-Roman world cultivated forms of asceticism. So philosophers like Pythagoras, Empedocles, Plato, and the Stoics in general, they practiced disciplines of silence, celibacy, and poverty, but they promoted the self-examination and this detachment from the sensual pleasure, because they saw this um, this disciplines or practices as a path to wisdom and self-mastery and inner harmony. So on the surface, these ideals might resemble those of the Christian monks in the history, but the heart is different because for the Greek philosophers, asceticism was a means of personal excellence, a gaining control to attaining virtue, to becoming self-sufficient. So the goal was self-possession. In the Christian monasticism, however, the goal is not self-possession, but the surrender of the self. So this is totally different from what the Greek and Roman philosophical asceticism promoted in that period of time. So just un momento, just a minute. Sorry about that. So I was saying that so the perspective of the Christian monastic movement was not the autonomy, but a total submission to Christ. So, and this changed everything, and this made the the ascetic Greek and Roman philosophical movements apart from from the Christian movement. So the monk renounces power, while the Greek philosopher, seek the power through the self-possession and the mastery of the mind. So it doesn't mean that the Christian monk did not look for that knowledge and conscience of the transcendence and what is true, but he was surrendering his mind and surrendered all his self in order to achieve that knowledge. So this is completely different from the Greek and philosophical monastic movement. So that's why the desert fathers often were perceived for the Greek society as foolish, so totally fool, because they were abandoning everything, and their goal was not a philosophical insight. So they were trying to lose everything in order for the sake of Christ, in order to gain Christ and get knowledge about the truth and the scriptures. So this was totally foolish, but for the Greek and philosophical ascetics. So in short, the philosophy in the Greek society and worldview sought mastery, and Christian monasticism sought transformation. So we have a shared language, but distinct metaphysics. So perhaps the tradition that most closely resemble the Christian monasticism, at least, is Neoplatonism. Because this school of thought was shaped by Plotinus and other people. And also they speak of ascent. They speak of purification, contemplation, and ecstasy. But it promotes interior silence and the renunciation of passion in order to gain the mastery of the mind. So, but the similarity then, and in language, hide the profound divergence. Is that a word? Divergence? Divergencia, Randy?
Divergence is okay.
Yeah, so we have a similarity in the language, but it is a very huge and profound divergence and difference, because the Neoplatonism believes that the world of believes that the world of multiplicity is fall from the one, right? So the salvation consists in returning to pure unity to the one by shredding or erasing or removing all the particularity, especially the material. So the body is a lower form of the being to be transcended. So, but the Christian monk, by contrast, they do not seek to escape the body. So they wanted to sanctify it and submit it to the absolute God. So this is a total different worldview. So it could share it could share language, it could share perspectives, but the heart is completely different. So he doesn't climb toward an abstract principle. So monasticism, Christian monasticism, did not try to seek something that is abstract, but it responds a call to a personal God, and this makes totally different. So they are trying to subdue all itself to a personal God and to Christ, who became flesh. That suffered, that died, and was rose again. So this changed the entire idea of the Greek philosophers that the body was that a lesser that lesser importance, because the Christian monk was submitting his body to seek a personal God that was embodied in a man, and he died and resurrected in his body. So this changed entirely the perspective of the Greek ascetic philosophical law. So for the Christian, salvation is not absorption for the one, it is communion with that personal God. So it is not self-transcendence, what we are trying to, or what they were trying to find, but the one's own power by they were not seeking that self-transcendence, but the one's own power to the one and that union to the one, but transfiguration done by that personal God by grace. And the Desert Fathers knew well, the way up is the way down to submit to that personal God. So the monk is not a mystic escaping the world into abstract light from Greek perspective. He's a disciple. So the monk was a disciple that entered to the desert to be a stripe of pride, shaped by humility, and feel the transfiguration of the self, not the escape of the self. So I have a lot of I have many slides, but I want to cover some things of the Desert Fathers in Egypt and Syria and Persia. But I think that I can mention this very quickly because I would like to have some discussion after the presentation. So we said before that throughout history and across many civilizations, humanity has repeatedly given monastic expression. So from the Desert Fathers in Egypt to temples in the Tibet, the Sufi Sawiyas to indigenous hermits in Americas, in the Native Americas. So we have many patterns across all of them. First, the separation of the world, the celibacy, prayer, So all monasticism implies asceticism, voluntary suffering, to express some sort of devotion of purity of the self. And this helps us to prove the sociological and anthropological charge that I am trying to make and emphasize of the monastic phenomenon. So, but we can talk as well about the specificity of the Christian monasticism. Now that we have seen how monasticism has appeared across many religions and reflects a deep anthropological reality, so we must ask, what then makes Christian monasticism unique? So the answer begins, of course, with the scriptures. So Christian monasticism is not just about self-discipline or transcendence. It's about Christ as a personal God. It is a response to a call. And if anyone would follow me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. That was the major call that the ascetics and those initial monks were trying to obey. So the Christian monks does not flee the world to escape reality. He withdraws the order to follow that call and be transformed and then become useful for the wider society where he was taken away. And this is very important. And I say this all the time. They were not escaping the world. They were leaving the society and the wider society to create a new model of society in their communities. And that a small society then started to expand and influence the wider society that they abandoned in first instance. So many traditions had the goal of the dissolution of the self or merging with an impersonal reality, the one. The Christian monk seeks a union with a personal God. And this is as we talk about, this is a human phenomenon, an anthropological phenomenon, but the Christianity is unique in this perspective. Here I make a comparison between the Indian and Buddhist monasticism. You can read it when I send this PDF slides. This is the Serapis recluses and why, and I make a comparison between the Christian monastic movement in Egypt with the Serapis recluses and why they are different. I make it as well because they're a new anthropologist and new sociologist that in modernity they were claiming that Christian monasticism was a copy of the Druids or the Irish worldview. But you can cover this as well, and if you have some questions, we can cover it in the chat, because I don't want to spend too much time with this. This is very dense, and I don't want to take too much time with this. I have a comment here. New chat. Egyptian, Randy.
Thank you.
So let's cover the Christian origin of monasticism. So we will focus now on the Christian phenomenon So we have key sources and testimonies. So we want to explore now what's the origin of Christian monasticism. So we have Eusebius of Caesarea, who plays a central role, identifying the therapeutae that were described by Philo of Alexandria with the apostolic community. So he reads the Acts of the apostles through the lens of the ascetic movement of his time, and he suggests that there was a continuity that could not be totally historical, but he found some theological meaning in that continuation. Saint Jerome as well makes a similar connection. Notably, he introduced continence as a part of the monastic element, a shift from the shared life and Eucharistic communion of the early church to a life of sexual renunciation. So this is Jerome, the first one talking about this sexual renunciation, but this was I'm talking about the first thinkers about the monastic movement in Christianity. So this interpretation shows that is not that monasticism simply came from other traditions like the Hellenistic philosophical asceticism, but that early Christians sought to frame the new movement in dialogue with the same language, with the same categories, but rooting with the scriptures and the gospel and the seek of that communion with the personal God. So the thesis is that monasticism is not a flight into foreign philosophy, but a human and anthropological phenomenon that Christians innovated by interpreting the phenomenon for the sake of the transcendence and the community with the personal God. This is the way as the Christian monasticism was thought at the beginning. So we had a transition from asceticism to monasticism because this was key in Christian history, right? So it wasn't merely a lifestyle choice, or it was a theological shift. So when persecution ended, and the martyrdom of the suffered by the Christians because of the Roman Empire, they became rare, right? Because the persecution stopped. So a new form of total commitment emerged. So the monk is the new martyr, and this is as the first monks thought about it, and we will cover this historically next in the next slides. But the church father, like Origen and Rufinus, they said that this link. So the solitary struggle of the monk was a resemble of the Christian suffering of the empire under the persecution of the empire. So the monasticism did not arise from a single source. From the beginning, various forms coexisted. So we had desert hermits, we had semi-eremitic communities, we had urban monasteries, and we had the Cenobitic movement after that, and monastic movement in the medieval time. So the movement was not linear; it was pluriform at the beginning, and they were driven by by that desire to have communion with the personal and transcendent God. So we had this movement from asceticism to monasticism, from the living alone and then conforming communities, because this was product of the study of the scriptures itself. This study produces, at some point, the conformation of communities. So, as well, this is very, very important. Monasticism is a prophetic response to the church and to the situation of the church. The rise of the desert monasticism in the 4th century was a response because the church was freed from the persecution by Constantine. They entered a period of comfort and favor. That favor became a trap. Christians, once they were radical, they were suffering. Now they were compromised with peace with the empire. So monasticism emerged in that period of time. They emerged not to reject the world, but they rejected the world of the empire. And they rejected the world of the church that were compromised with the empire. This is something very emphatic that I want to make clear in this session. A Christianized empire begun to water down the church, and we can cover this. And one of the master and champion books on this is that book by Walter Ullmann, The Papal Authority. The name of the book is Papal Authority and the Conflict with the Roman Empire. And I am writing a chapter of my book on this period of time. And the idea is to understand why the Pope, or the figure of the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church, gaining such an importance in the structure of the church, because it was a clash between the empire and the church, and the result of that clash and the solution of the Roman Catholic Church at that period of time was the creation of that authority of a Pope and that figure. Of course, this was not the best solution, but it was a solution against the I don't know how to say this in English, but it is Cesaropapismo. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to say that in English. Randy, can you help me?
I think it's just Caesar Papism, but I'm not sure.
Papism. So, Hilary of Poitiers, he lamented this shift because he said he would prefer the days of the Nero to those of Constantius, because now the persecution came in another form. So while Nero was persecuting and the blood of the Christian was filling the streets, right? So now the new persecution is a compromise with the power, and the persecution came with gold, with power, with position. It is a new, different persecution, and this is totally for our times, right now, where the church is tempted to have that fusion with political parties, that fusion with political powers, and they think that the discipleship of the nation would be done by that union with the empire. So what was the response? The monks created a sodality to solve that compromise with the political power. So this was a rebuke to the bishops. This was a prophetic denunciation to the bishops. This was a rebuke to the church that had become wealthy, they were comfortable, and they were compromised. Their silence in the desert were louder than the sermons of them in the big temples. Their withdrawal were more confrontational than the concils and all the stuff that they were doing in the empire. So monasticism is a prophetic denunciation, an apostolic denunciation against a church that is at risk. This is, do you see this screen? Can read that?
Yes.
Yes, it's very small, but we can see it.
I'm trying to make it wider. Can you see that? Sorry, this is my fault.
I can see it.
Well, the idea is that that the origins of the Egyptian monasticism, we can recall Anthony retreats to the Egyptian desert seeking solitude with God, but he was not the first doing this. So he follows Jesus' commands, go and sell all what you have, and we can read that in Matthew chapter 19. He was fame spreads despite his isolation. So there were a lot of people visiting in his isolation, and he was visiting new communities. And we had Athanasius going to know Anthony of the Desert. They had a very close relationship. And he is considered the father of monasticism due to his influence, not chronology, because again, he was not the first doing this. So his life became a model of ascetic imitation of Christ. Athanasius writes the Vita Antoni, which is the most influential hagiography of Christian history. I said hagiography, but this does not mean that it doesn't have historical importance. Although it is hagiography, it has very historical elements that we need to address. As well, we had Jerome, Sulpius Severus, Cassiano, Cassian. They transmit and idealize the Egyptian monasticism. It is Athanasius who brought the first monks of Egypt into Europe, and it was this experience of the Europeans seeing the first monks in their history that they started to follow the monastic goal as something that they need to achieve as well. So we have texts of hagiographies, not biographies, but they were edifying narratives that shaped for imitation. They were trying to recruit people. This was the main purpose of this first text. So they built the literary memory of the desert as a sacred geography. Communes founded the first organized monastic communities. The monks started to live under a rule. They shared prayers, laborers, meals. The cenobium contrasted with the eremitic ideal of total solitude. So, but as I mentioned before, there was a shift, a theological shift. It was not a practical shift or something similar. So it created a new model of Christian communal life rooted in discipline. So when we are talking about apostolic communities, this is sort of some elements of the monasticism is some elements that we need to cover. And that's why we emphasize all the time, it is important for the Christian faith to emphasize on community and the community life. And what we are having right now in the local churches, they do not have community. This is a false sense of community. And this is something that we need to recover, not to copy the monasticism and paste it in our movement, but to recover the biblical sense of community and familiar and family life of the Christian in the Christian faith. So the desert monks were prophetic witnesses. So, as I said, after the persecution ended, Christianity were at risk of becoming just another religion of the empire. So they were safe, they were wealthy, they were respected, they had authority and influence, but the monks remembered the cost of the discipleship, and they raided clothes, they were in silence, they were in poverty, and said, well, now you're living as a bishop, as a rich bishop, because you're compromised with the empire. Now I live in poverty because of that, and returning to what Christ has said. Not because Christ has said us or commanded us to be poor, but it was a prophetic denunciation against the compromise with the kingdom. So they kept alive in the memory of the martyrs. They reminded that the church, that to follow Christ is still to leave everything and abandon everything in order to follow Christ. As how do you say Philippians?
Philippians.
Yes, and I'm talking about the rule of the goal right now. The rule of the goal in Philippians
chapter 3.
To live and lose everything, leave everything in order to gain God and Christ. And as he said, himself said, right? Seek first the kingdom, seek first the king, and everything will be added to that. So they were trying to do that. So, and we had as I mentioned before, the Egyptian monasticism had a very huge impact in Palestine, Syria, Cappadocia, and beyond. And eventually they impacted Europe as well. So the Egyptian desert was not the end of the story, right? It was the beginning. So from the Tebaida, from the divide, the Tebaida, Randy, I don't know how to say that in Spanish, in English, sorry. The divide to go monasticism was the womb of the Christian renewal and the Christian apostolic movement, because there was the monastic movement that discipled entire nations in Europe and this part of the world. So even where the deserts did not exist, the Christian created the symbolic deserts in cloisters, and because the desert monks were not marginal, they were prophetic. They were voices crying out, make straight the way of the Lord. They were total evangelistics. So after the intense flowering of monasticism in Egypt, the movement did not remain confined to there. So it rapidly went to Palestine, Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia. But this expansion was not only geographical, it was totally social phenomenon. So they were creating societies in the societies. They were inside the societies, and they were impacting wider societies. So each region received the monastic spirit and the monastic impulse with its own particular elements and tones, and they were shaped as well by the local circumstances, the theological concerns that they had in those places, and the social needs that those places had. And this is exactly the same, Randy, that we have in the missionary movement. You send an apostolic team, and they have their own expression of what the church will be there. And this is exactly what happened with the monastic movement when the monastic going and the monks going to Persia, going to Palestine, going to Syria. It is the same thing. So this influence and expansion of the monastic movement was apostolic at core. So what began in Egypt, in Egyptian desert, as a radical return to the gospel, had a new expression in Palestine, for example. We need to cover that. And the Palestine monasticism between the desert and the holy places. So in Palestine, monasticism was drawn between two forces: the call of the desert, so central to the Egyptian tradition, and the spiritual magnetism of Jerusalem. So many monks stayed in caves and lavras near the Jerusalem city, and where they could combine solitude with access to the sacred places and associated with the life and death and resurrection of Christ. So this form of monastic life became a living text of the sacred places, right? Of the sacred places in which the monk's life became the response to the gospel of God, because they were not only living in solitude, because they went to the holy places and they started to preach and they started to evangelize in the holy city. So this was very interesting and intriguing, how the Palestine monastic movement acted in the holy places. So they were not isolated mystics. They were seen intercessors for the church and for the world. They prayed all the time. This was some of the I would play some of the bibliography to go deeper on those movements and in that period of time, because they were famous praying in the streets in the holy city. So this is totally different from the idea that we have that they were escaping the world and escaping society and escaping reality. This is totally a contradiction with that idea. So different from the Canavitic life of the Pacomian monasteries in Egypt, the lavra was the semi-eremitic structure of the Palestinian movement. The hermits lived in separate caves. They live or cells that were spread across a valley. They gathered only once a week. They usually gather on Saturdays or Sundays for common meetings, for confession, for sharing meals. So the model preserved the value of the solitude, but they avoided the isolation that could lead to confusion or delusion of a movement. So it provided space for the deep personal prayer, while they were anchoring each monk in the rhythm of the wider body of the church in those holy places. So the Labra of the Palestinian movement embodies the theology of the communion. And that doesn't suppress the individual seek for the communion with God, but it integrates the solitude and community. So in Syria as well, we have a unique form of monastic witness, the stylites. I don't know how to say that in English, Randy. In Spanish, it is estalitas. In Spanish,
stylites is the way I would say
yeah. Yeah. These were men, they were going to pillars, high pillars, and they lived then for years, decades. They were exposed to sun, to wind, and gaze for the world. But not only that, they were famous of them. So Saint Simeon, the Esthalite, they live atop of a column for 37 years. But he was not just doing that. He was a very good preacher. He received visitors. He answered letters and studied and translated the scriptures. So his asceticism was not an escape of the world, but a confrontation with the world. So something different, and something different what was the reality of the church and with the new peace with the empire. So of course he was a public servant. He was visible. He was radical. He had some testimonies of prophetic denunciation and resistance against the church and against Constantine. So this is not a fancy and a wacko man going to live in a pillar. He was total prophet denouncing the church and the compromise with the empire. So they sacrificed the space where they live, right? But they were suspended. They lived in pillars, so they were pointing out to the heaven, and they came down to preach and to live accordingly with the wider body of the church. And this is the how I would say that the diverse form that they had in order to make or accomplish what they were called to do. So another distinguished feature of the monasticism in Palestine and Syria was the close relationship with the bishops. Some of the bishops were supportive of the monastic movement. Some of them were totally against it because they felt that they were attacking the episcopate, right? Because they were totally against that compromise of them with the kingdom. So unlike the tensions that sometimes existed between the bishop and monks in other regions, in Syria and Palestine, they had this relationship that was often of collaboration. And in Egypt, as well, so if we come back to Egypt, there was a sort of collaboration between the modality and sodality, between the dioceses and the sodality movement, the community, in the figures of Athanasius and Anthony of the Desert. So bishops like Cyril of Jerusalem supported the monastic communities. They saw an importance of the renewal of the Christian life and of the church, and often they relied on the monks as theologians and theological allies, right? So the monks were not isolated fanatics. They were not fundamentalists. They had this sense of responsibility, and they were radical in the way that they denounced it, the problem that the church were facing. So the legacy of the Syrian and Palestine monasticism, the monks of Palestine and Syria were not just ascetics in the way that we are used to think. We have figures like Evagrius Ponticus. He had writings laid the foundation for what it is called in the Catholic Church as the mystical theology. But we had in the Protestant side something related to that as the spiritual warfare, for example. He influenced Woodridge deep in both the Eastern and Western traditions. So these monks read the scripture not only with the mind, but with the whole perspective, not only with superficially, but with the whole perspective. Their lives were a liturgy. And when I say a liturgy, I'm saying a public service. Mm-hmm. This is what liturgy means. Mm-hmm. So their prayers and their preaches were hermeneutics, and they were doing hermeneutics and exegesis of the scriptures. So in their solitude, they encounter these disciplines of the interpretation of the scripture. Because I would like to say that the discipline, it is a discipline and a commandment to study the Bible and to study the scripture. Well, they did it. They translated it. They commented it. And this is my last one. So I would like to give some time to comments, discussions, questions if you have. Okay, Daniel said that he had a call.
Yeah, he said he had to leave early, remember?
Yeah. Okay, so we'll stop the share. So do you have some comments, some ideas that you want to share?
I find your approach, Lester, extremely refreshing in the light of a lot of the normal reading that one does on this, especially coming from the Protestant tradition and from a lot of the stuff you hear from the pulpits in Latin America and the pulpits in the US against the Desert Fathers and the monastic movement and the fleeing from the world. I think that your analysis of it being a prophetic denunciation is very, very important. And I find that refreshing. And also your sociological comparison of this being a human phenomenon. And that's something that Dr. Winter brought out with the sodalities, that sodalities exist in all human societies. And it's inevitable, whether the bishops and the churches want it or not, they're going to spring up just because it's a human phenomena, but especially in Christianity, it springs up as an expression, a prophetic protest, or an expression of the organic life of the Spirit in the people in the church, and in spite of the church itself. So I find your expression, your more positive approach to what's normally seen as negative, especially on the ascetical aspects of the Desert Fathers. Very, very refreshing and very an important addition to the analysis that you hear from almost everywhere else. So thank you for that.
Yeah, definitely. So we have to understand what is the historical period that they started. So basically, they are heirs of the martyrs. So basically, after that, after the peace of Constantine, they were another reality that the church were living, right? So what the monks were doing in the caves and that ascetic life were remembering the church that were compromised with the empire, that persecution, and denouncing the lives and all the privilege that they were having at risk of becoming very superficial and just another religion of the empire. And they did this in a very radical way, and I would say very biblical way, since you can see in the Old Testament doing prophets weird things, right? So what they were doing is confronting the bishops and confronting those that were in the court and living in the court of the emperor.
Yeah, exactly. The whole emphasis of fleeing from the world, I was just thinking about, and it's interesting that you mentioned that the fleeing from the world actually became apostolic. I was just thinking that men like Thomas Merton, who were living the radical Trappist Cistercian calling in the Gethsemane monastery of supposedly freeing from the world, he became one of the most prophetic and prolific writers that influenced the whole church worldwide, in spite of his hermitage in the Kentucky mountains of Gethsemane. So it's quite ironic that in the end they become apostolic in spite of themselves, as Latterette brings out, that the monks, in spite of themselves, became the best, the greatest expression of Christian missions for over 1,000 years before the Protestants even came into existence.
Yeah, so something similar happened to the Desert Fathers. They were living alone, but basically they never accomplished that because people they were draining people, they were dragging people to attracting people, and they were going to other communities in the Thebaid. I recommend a book on Athanasius and the monastic movement. So basically, after the fourth condemnation by Athanasius, because by the way, it was the empire trying to impose the interpretation of the Christian faith, and was Athanasius trying to defend the orthodoxy. He was sent to the desert and how do you say exiliado, to the exile, right?
He was exiled.
While exiled, so he went to the monastic communities, and he was traveling across the communities, and a lot of monks were traveling with him in order to defend the Christian faith against the Caesaropapism movements in Alexandria. So the idea that they were leaving the world, they were in solitude, this is totally a misunderstanding of the history of the monastic and the desert movement in Egypt.
Well, the other thing is that there's also a psychological phase that nobody seems to remember that Moses was in the desert for 40 years on the backside of the desert, where God was taking Egypt out of Moses before Moses then was launched in his mission to bring Israel out. The same way with Paul. Paul went into the desert to be alone with God for, I don't know, was it 7 years or 14 years? We see this time and time again. Anthony supposedly flees, tries to be alone, but then he comes back as a prophetic witness to the and a counselor to the kings.
Yeah, yeah. Stephen, do you have some comments, some questions?
Not a great deal. No, one of the things I read, and this was in relation to the Desert Fathers, was that sometimes it's not appreciated that back then it was a common idea that the deserts were where the demons lived.
Mm.
And where I read this, this was suggesting this was the only reason that they went into the desert, because I think there were complex reasons as to why they did that, including what you said about the protest against the worldliness of the church, that kind of thing. But also, it was certainly, if you read the lives of these people, they seem to have be constantly, at least perceive themselves to be doing battle with demons. And you went out into the desert to do battle with demons, you see, because that's where the demons live. And that was, I'm not saying that's the case, I'm just saying it was perceived that way. So they went, to some extent, not completely, but they went into the desert, or at least were perceived to, and were perceived themselves as going into the desert to do battle with demons, which is an interesting idea. And I think often the reasons were quite complex as to why they did those things. But as you say, they didn't always stay in the desert. Oftentimes they came back and took on other responsibilities and roles as well. But yes, it's very interesting.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, it is important to analyze this sociological situation that they had, the historical period that they lived, and the anthropological view that I try to emphasize as well in this. It is important because there's more, as you say, there's more complexity of what was happening, what they're living and facing. So this is why I try to give this focus, because there is plenty literature about their denunciations against the bishops. So it is important to emphasize that. And yeah, for sure, some of them fall in some things that are not, orthodox or something, for sure. As we live in the church right now, some churches are not following orthodoxy and doing some stuff that is not beneficial for the kingdom, or beneficial for the discipleship of the nations, of course. But it is undeniable that the movement in the desert were spreading across the Middle East, Europe, and basically that movement and that origin started a process of discipleship of the nations in Europe, and and created the Western society as a whole. So in some case, I would say The Europe and the Western civilization is a child of the Egyptian Christianity because of the impulse of this group that were apostolic at the core, right? I am not saying that the that we live in complete and a unique equality between societies and what some call culture, but for sure it was the Egyptian church, the Egyptian communities that started these sodalities that were heirs of the apostolic bands, and basically the followers in Europe of those apostolic bands discipled the entire Europe. And I say, this is why I say, Randy, sometimes to people that are missionaries in Africa, and they say, well, basically we have a lot of territory that could call Christians, but we have very small theological foundations. But I say, not all the time was in that way. You had the monastic movement, the Desert Fathers, Athanasius, Saint Augustine, an African.
Tertullian.
So we have a very deep history in Africa and Christianity, and basically they shape in a huge way the Christian thought. So it is important to recognize those movements and what they have done, right?
I'd like Lester to go back to the point about the desert and Stephen's point about that they said that the deserts were places of the demons. I find it very archetypal that Jesus, when after his baptism, he was, I forget the word in the English, but he was driven into the desert by the Spirit. And,
right.
and I think in the desert, several things happened. For Jesus, it was his personal victory over Satan. And for the desert monks like Anthony, it was his victory over his own flesh and his own demons, and the attacks and the foolish attacks of the demons on them. The monastic, as Saint, the second founder of the Franciscans, what was his name? Bonaventure, in his little tract called the Triplici Via, the threefold way. Anciently, the first of the threefold way was called the purgative way, which Protestants don't like, but the greatest theologian of all the Protestants, according to John Piper, who was the great Puritan, the greatest of theologians. He calls him the mighty oak of theologians. I'm forgetting his name. Anyway, he called it in his book. He talked about the purgative, the purgation of our lives, and the being released from our sinful nature in a practical, experimental way. So I think this is happening because Anthony and the Desert Fathers, many of them gained the victory over their own personal demons and their own personal flesh. And as they gained that victory, they came into what the second way is called the illuminative way. They were illuminated by the Holy Spirit and empowered then to go back and to become great prophets, even healers. I mean, Anthony had a healing ministry that was very famous. And he also had, he could read the thoughts of people in almost very similar way that Jesus did. There was such a great purity in his own personal life because of his victory You know, and in the first 3 letters of the book of Revelation, it says that if you gain the ascendancy and the victory, I will make you this, I will make you a pillar, I will do this, and I will do that. And so when they had personal victory over these demons and over the world, the flesh, and the devil, then they came down from the mountain or out from the desert to illuminate the valleys with the power of the Holy Spirit. That's kind of the way I see it. And then they moved in the third way, which was the unitive way, where they began to have a closer, more intimate walk with the Lord that I'm bringing out in my book on Ruth that we're now editing.
There is I'm a bit reluctant to say this, to be honest, but I think I want to say it. To try and, maybe not a direct comparison, but try and bring some kind of perspective of what they did with the modern world in this sense that sometimes in order to gain real perspective, you need to stand back.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to paint with oils for a hobby, but the room I painted in was very narrow, and I was very up near the painting. And it's okay working on small things, but you really need to stand back to assess the effects of what you're doing over the whole thing. And I used to find it difficult because I didn't have the room to stand back, so I used to take a photograph with my iPad, and that sort of gave me the perspective. And that standing back is very important in that kind of situation. But I think it's also relevant in church life because you can be so involved and so, how can I put this? So
committed and absorbed.
Yes, so absorbed in the minutiae of what's going on that you don't get a real perspective of the whole thing in its context. And I have said sometimes that when I have looked at church life, particularly in this country, and I can't say how it is in Latin America and other countries. I can only speak about Britain. And today in Britain, the church is in free fall. You have a choice. You can go to an heretical church or you can go to an apostate church. But you don't have much in between. Or you can go to a heretical apostate church as well. You can go to that. The problem is there is no prophetic voice of the church to the nation. The church is following the world. I mean, it's not just the Church of England, although in particular it's the Church of England, because that is the national church. It's almost unrecognizable as the church anymore, is the Church of England. And it's so of a lot of the big mainline denominations. They do not represent the faith once delivered. They are so corrupt, so theologically corrupt, morally corrupt, and corrupted in some way by the power politics of those who are at in positions of leadership. Even in the smaller denominations, this obsession with leadership courses, leadership teams, who's in the leadership this, leadership that, leadership. It's all about who's being in the lead. There's actually no leadership in the church in Britain today. The Church of England is a. That's not to say that there aren't some people in the Church of England that are not. There are, and there are always exceptions. But when you look at the whole thing as an organisation, it really, we have to be honest and say it's apostate now. And the problem is, while you're involved in that, trying to work in that situation, it's actually very difficult sometimes to really understand what's going on And what happens is every slip, every backslidden slip, you backslide so far, it's easier to backslide just a little more and a little more. And the whole thing starts going down. And you don't really see what's happening. Sometimes you need to stand back and get perspective. And it's very difficult to do that when you're right in the midst of it. And I wonder whether that's why the leadership in the church in this nation doesn't get that perspective. And I have to say, it really doesn't. That perspective of what has happened to the church, of its implosion and it's falling from grace, it's absolute, it's in free fall now. There is no concept of that in the leadership in the big denominations or the small denominations or the small independent free churches. And what's happened, and I'm not sure that I want to draw too much of a parallel, but I just find it interesting. A lot of Christians no longer go to church. And because you're denominational types, I say, oh, well, they're not Christians, I mean, I've met people like this, and if you don't go to church, you're not a Christian. Actually, it tends to be the committed Christians that are abandoning church now. It's the nominal Christians that are left in church in this country, in my opinion.
My word!
And I'm talking, I'm not saying in every instance, but pretty much across the board, we are in a terrible state. And I don't know. I think maybe it's difficult to look from another country to see what the state it's in. But here, those who are in the churches just think, oh, well, if he's not coming to church, he's not a Christian. Actually, no, they're so fed up because they can't make any headway in terms of the Christian faith.
Wow.
With what's happening. And I wonder if there's something similar going on to what happened with some of the monastics and the desert fathers. It was a protest against the corruption, the spiritual corruption. It was a protest. Now, and going out into the desert, it does seem pretty extreme. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to assess what motivates people. Back then, it was a completely different culture, completely different time. It's you have to be careful not to just draw glib comparisons and say, oh, well, it's because they weren't functioning as real Christians. Like church people say today, if a person's not going to church, well, it's because it's not a Christian. Actually, it's often because they are Christians. But what it does is, and this is what I'm trying to get at the point is, withdrawing like that sometimes gives you a perspective which those involved in the minutiae of it do not see. And they do not see the desperately apostate state of the church. And often those who stand back, they get this perspective and then they're alarmed by it. But do you see what I'm trying to say? The comparison I'm trying to draw.
And I get in it. I didn't get in it. And I find it very, very interesting what you're saying, Stephen. I think it would be prophetic. Where right now we are not going to the deserts and we are not moving to Egypt, right? But we are retreating from my position. I am retreating from the church, and that would represent my desert. Some of you, and I can remember some people.
You're cutting out, Lester.
Calling you.
No. Sorry.
You were cutting out, Lester.
So in the eyes of other people, you already have your own cave where you are reclusing you, but this is not, well, I am just following further the analogies, and I think that you're pointing out a very interesting point, right?
Yes, there have been occasions where I have withdrawn. I am honest. I'll be honest with you, and it's given me a very, very. It's given me a very different kind of perspective on what's happening.
Yeah,
I do go to church now, but there have been occasions where I've withdrawn, not just merely because I wanted to, but well, we won't go to. I do go to church, but when I go back to church now and I see what's happening, I find it sometimes almost distressing. And you have to think, well, it's no good being distressed by this. You've got to think, how do I deal with this situation? The problem is that the church, these churches are in this situation of utter decline and irrelevance, and I would say paralysis. I would say one of the things that defines it is paralysis, and a total lack of prophetic ministry. And I know we have lots of charismatic churches here who make a big deal about prophetic, and I see no prophecy. I see almost no prophetic ministry at all in those churches, in any of the churches. I'm not saying none at all, but on the whole, it's just not there. And the problem then is, of course, when you talk to people, you're talking to people who don't have that perspective. And so it's very difficult to make headway. It's the triumph of the irrelevance that goes on in church. I find it astonishing. Now, I'm only speaking of this country. I have no right to speak about other nations. Things may well be better, or it may be that they haven't fallen as far down as Britain has fallen, and they're going to get down here sometime. I don't know, but the spiritual condition here in the United Kingdom is astonishingly bad. It really is distressing, is the word for it. But I don't think people get it. They're so up on the coalface, if you like, that they can't see the mine. I don't know if that's a good analogy. They just don't get the perspective. It's not there. And so that, there needs to be that perspective, and there aren't many people with the perspective to show that. And like the bishops, sometimes one of the let me paint with a broad brush now. Throughout the monastic movement, which was well over 1,000 years long, often there have been conflict between the monastics and the, if you like, the what's they called the secular church, the non-monastic ecclesiastical church. And in a way, I think there is a little bit something similar happening today. It wouldn't be institutionalizing quite the same way, but I think it's happening. And I think it's happening. Some of the church leaders do know the problem, but they don't know what to do about it. The Church of England talks about the de-churched, the unchurched, the de-churched, and the churched. But they don't really have answers. They realize there's a problem, but they don't really have the answers. Their answer is to choose for ministers people who are good managers. And I've had them say this to me. What we want is people who are good managers. But they tend to screen out, and this is particularly the case with the Church of England, but the others as well. They screen out people with vision and people with callings. And so what they're doing is managing their decline very well. It's a well-managed decline, but it is a decline. And that's what we've had here now. I mean, I would say that's been going on in my lifetime. And I'm 70 now. Well, nearly 70.
Wow. Wow.
Going back to what Stephen was talking about, I think that success can be the way to your failure. So we need to be careful right now because we're in a phase of desert. But the desert can become a way to success. And if we don't establish the discipline the spiritual discipline of stepping back. As Stephen was talking, I was reminded of St. Francis, that they would go out on these preaching tours, and they were going from village to village and preaching and evangelizing. And they would do that for a time, and then they would step back and go into retreat for several weeks or months up in the mountains. And I began to notice as I was studying this, and you see that in the life of Jesus, this cycle of retreat. It says, and Jesus departed into a solitary or lonely place and was praying. So unless we establish the monastic discipline of solitude, silence, and retreat as a discipline, or you could call it the stepping back, our very success as an apostolic community, if we would all of a sudden go viral with a video, and all of a sudden we have hundreds of young people signing on, then comes our soon downfall, because then we become like the bishops and the pastors, swarmed with the doing. We become the inevitable Marthas, and Maria goes out the window. So there has to be a balance between solitude, silence, retreat, and stepping back, and ministry. And St. Francis, as I studied his life, it became a very, very good model for me of that sort of cyclic stepping back. I like that word, stepping back, because you get perspective, and then you get refilled with the Spirit, or you burn out. And a lot of these pastors just burn out. I mean, we came to a point here in Costa Rica where pastors were falling into sin, falling like flies. And it was because they did not have a discipline of retreat, silence, and stepping back, that they just burned out.
It's interesting you say that, because there seems to be so much of that. You know, that pastors really falling.
Well, that's happening because
but the people as well.
Their success is their failure.
Yeah, so as a Puritan said something like, you need to be really aware that your strong point is the point at which you might fail. Can't remember who it was. It was a Puritan. Your strong point can be your weak point, because you're so confident in it, and you don't see the how you're going to fail at that point. That's often the case.
O thou that bringeth good tidings to Zion, get thee up to the high mountain. I mean, if you're going to be bringing good tidings, in fact, the writer St. Thomas à Kempis said, one has no right to public ministry that has not had the discipline of being alone with God first. And the Song of Solomon is so clear. He said, I have tasted my myrrh, I have tasted my honey, I've tasted my... In other words, the husband has the first right of ministering to God first, in our relationship with him first. Then he says, drink and come and drink of my bride. And so he says that you are a closed fountain, a shut up stream. And then he invites, it's almost as if in the Song of Solomon, he invites the nations to come drink from his bride. But first, we have to be with him, or then we become a dry well, and just we ruin ourselves.
Yeah, I think that we need in the situation we're in, certainly in this country, we need committed sodalities, communities, people with a shared vision and calling who can work together. And we have to actually find those who are similarly called. It's not everybody's calling to do this. And callings in the Christian life, do vary. And you can have different communities which have different callings pursuing. But certainly when it comes to mission, when it comes to proclaiming the gospel, the mission, we do need apostolic mission, apostolic community, and sodalities of those with those callings. Because what if they go into the churches, let me put it this way, on their own, it can be dangerous, because they're entering into a battle, a spiritual battle. and Jesus sent them out in twos, not in ones. And Paul traveled with his companions. They weren't singular, but they were going to places proclaiming the gospel. The churches, if you like, the ecclesias were being formed as a result of their activity. But they needed to draw an example, you had the desert fathers who were often on their own, but not always on their own. Sometimes they were like communities of hermits, which sounds a bit peculiar, but they were. And then you had the Kenobitic ones where communities were formed, and they were able then to provide models, a model for what the spiritual life is. Now, I'm not saying that I would necessarily agree with everything that they did. I wouldn't. But in 500 years, people might not agree with everything I'm saying either. What I'm saying is we all need each other. We're not. In my opinion, the truth is absolute. But as human beings, we need each other in order to understand the truth. We need that community. And now this is going to sound like a bit of a contradiction. The problem is in the churches at the moment in this country is that you don't get that community. What you get is it's not that community in the faith of those who are seeking a particular goal. It's a, I don't know what it's not pursuing the kingdom. You see, my problem is I go into the church and I do not see the kingdom of God being a priority at all. I see it talked about, for example, in the Vineyard Church. They make a big deal about how their thing is all about the kingdom. But when you hear them explain it, it's not about the kingdom. It's just signs and wonders, and these signs and wonders in the Vineyard Church are conspicuous by their absence. And when there's very little for those churches, that talk about the kingdom, you can't even get a definition of the kingdom out of people. They talk around it all the time. And so I although we're talking about the desert, one of the problems for me is when I go to these churches, I find them deserts in the worst sense. I don't find them aesthetic, spiritual, theological, or communities of like-minded people with a desire for the kingdom of God and the Great Commission. I don't find that. I find them real deserts, to be honest. And in the sense that when the monks went out into the desert and set up a monastery, they had a real community of people similarly minded with a similar goal. And it functioned as a community. You may have some criticisms of that community, I do, but they were the ones who converted Europe. The secular church did not convert Europe. It was the regular church that converted Europe.
Correct.
And but when I go to the churches, I just see people whose unity is ephemeral. Well, we might sing the same songs, or we might get off on a bit of an emotional trip singing this song, or we might have some kind of ideology that we're really into, like the Christian Zionism, which, you know, I see promoted a lot, which I find extremely troublesome. Or it might be the signs and wonders. We're going to wait for the signs and wonders now, which, as I say, don't seem to really turn up. And it's not, you know, there isn't that real community and unity in the faith. It's very ephemeral. And what I would say is it's overriding, my opinion, overridingly trivial, and because of that, I find it extremely disturbing. And to try and talk to people and say, well, you know, there's something more to this, they don't want to. It's almost like whistling in the dark. Well, let's pretend everything's all right, because if we open our eyes and see what's really happening, we're going to get a nasty scare, you know. So we really need, and I think it's this what's needed. We need a real renaissance of the Christian faith. And it won't come from within these churches, because these are old wineskins now. And it never does come from those from within those things, those old wineskins. And I think that we need to take these things seriously and these lessons seriously. But it is very complex, and but they're just, when you look in the churches, there just is not the mission orientation. There's not the concern for the Great Commission. Often it's not in words, but practically denied. And there's not the interest in the kingdom of God. And for those who want to pursue those things, it's very difficult staying in those churches because you just feel like you're in a brainwashing session. And the truth is, that's what you often are in. Brainwashing session. So anyway, that's I'm to some extent trying to draw some kind of comparison with what's happening today, with maybe what the early monks found were the deplorable state of the church that they were reacting against, and we have to likewise find communities that can, with the common vision, that can go forward. So it's very important. Sorry, I have waffled on a bit. Sorry, I didn't plan it, but that's my honest opinion.
The question, Lester, remains that what became so attractive to some of these, in other words, the St. Anthony went out there alone, but he never could stay alone because he started to attract so many young people and disciples. Maybe we're not yet radical enough to be like St. Anthony, to where those people are saying, hey, whatever these guys have, I want it, even though they seem weird and different. There's something there that I want. And that viral moment hasn't happened yet to our movement. And maybe the Lord still needs us in the desert for a while longer.
And it's possible, you know. I feel like in my own experience, like a desert all these years, being alone in Spain without having a group of people at least working. This is my desert. This is my divide, right? So but at the same time, I think that we should keep doing what we do, um, um, creating these courses, producing more articles, writing books, and that product of study, of analyzing and going deeper into scriptures and the Christian faith could in the future um, attract people to our movement. Um, I think as well it is necessary that living community with prayer, with that time of prayer together, study the Bible together. That's why we have that. Well, from my perspective, this is one of the most important things, and I think that's why I accepted to go to England and work with Stephen, because that is a crucial part of the community itself. That time of being together, not only work together, but have that union, and living as a community, as a family, to make something that to break something and start to attract people and drag them into the movement. I think that is necessary as well, because those that were following the desert fathers were people that as well felt that necessity at some point, and they were influenced and inspired but those that did it before. So I think that creating and starting communities with the people that you have, just start it. Go to the desert, and someone wants to go to the desert as well. Join together, make this effort together, and something would happen. I think that this unity in some way creates that breakthrough to a wider movement. That's why I thought, well, I need to go to and work to Stephen. Before that, I was thinking go and work with Brandy, because I think that having in the desert alone is not beneficial beyond me and my family. It's not beneficial for the entire kingdom and for all the group of people that we can impact, right? If we have 2 or 3, that is better, and that is I think a key to reach that point, Randy, that you were talking about, bringing more people to the community. I think that you have to start with 2, and then those 2 will reproduce and multiply, and they will multiply to 100. I don't know, but start with the people that you have. And I think that I have like more than 1 year saying this to this group and this chat, to start with the people that you have. Go and do the job. Eventually it will multiply.
Exactly.
Okay.
I keep talking about community to the people in our cultural apologetics group, and I've talked about community for many, many years in HIMF. But there's a threshold that it seems like some people like to talk about it, but they don't want to take the step. And I know Stephen has struggled with that too. And I've had some of my disciples that they like to talk about it, but when I press them for more commitment, then they start to, like the rich young ruler, flee. And so the startup phase in this curve is the hardest part.
I agree.
Because once you reach a threshold, if we had a threshold in a community of 10 to 12 people and people being sent out, then it starts to take off.
Yeah.
And that's what happened with Fethemech in the apostolic sense, but it never happened in the community sense. And now I've got I'm going to turn the